Well, Diana, looking at that, do you do all your own stunts? Did you do all your own stunts when you were doing the Avengers?
No, I didn't. I couldn't.
We know Patrick McNee best as John Steed, of course, in the 1960s TV series The Avengers.
Well, I think it's this awful problem.
Most people believe they know the Avengers from 1961. They remember the famous faces and stylish adventures that helped the series become a worldwide success. However, there was a much darker version of the Avengers that was erased by the studio. This wasn't just your regular spy series. Some of its scenes were considered so daring for their time that they raised concerns among broadcasters and television watchdogs. What was this disturbing version that suddenly vanished? And what were they trying so hard to bury? Join us as we uncover the secrets behind this original version. The Dark Avengers, the world forgot. When most people think of the Avengers, they picture a stylish world of secret agents, clever banter, elegant fashion, and unforgettable characters. They remember the polished John Steed with his sharp suits, bowler hat, and effortless charm. But that is not the version of the Avengers that first appeared on television. The original series that premiered on Saturday, the 7th of January, 1961, was a very different show. In many ways, it feels like an entirely different program from the one that later became famous around the world. Produced by ABC Television and broadcast on ITV, The Avengers arrived during a period when British television was changing rapidly. Audiences were becoming interested in more serious and realistic dramas, and the creators of the series decided to build their story around something surprisingly tragic. At the center of the show was Dr. David Keel, played by Ian Hendry. Unlike the glamorous spies that would later define the series, Keel was an ordinary doctor whose life was shattered by a terrible crime. In the very first episode, titled Hot Snow, his fiancée, Peggy, passed away because of members of a criminal organization. This surprising event is not simply part of the background story, it is the reason the series exists. Peggy's death drives everything that follows and pushes Keel into a dangerous search for justice. While investigating the people responsible, Keel joins forces with a mysterious man named John Steed, played by Patrick McNee. Modern viewers might be surprised by this version of Steed. He is not yet the sophisticated gentleman that later audiences would adore. Instead, he is a mysterious figure who moves through the shadows, gathering information and pursuing criminals through methods that often seem secretive and unpredictable. Even more surprising is the fact that Steed was not originally the star of the series. That role belonged to Keel. Ian Hendry was the leading actor, while Patrick McNee played a supporting character. Few people watching those early episodes could have guessed that Steed would eventually become the face of the entire franchise. The tone of the original series was also far darker than many people realize. Rather than focusing on eccentric villains or playful adventures, the stories explored death investigations, organized crime, corruption, smuggling operations, and undercover missions. The atmosphere was tense and serious, with danger lurking around every corner. These early episodes felt much closer to crime dramas and police investigations than to the stylish spy adventures that would later make the series famous. The stories were grounded in real threats and real consequences. Characters faced genuine risks, and the emotional weight of Peggy's death remained at the heart of the narrative. For television audiences in the early 1960s, this approach was unusually grim. Beginning a series with the violent loss of a main character's fiancée gave the show an emotional depth that set it apart from many other programs of the period. Now, let's take a look at the mysterious man helping Keel. Why was he far more dangerous than the gentleman audiences would later adore? The John Steed nobody would recognize today. When people think of John Steed, they usually picture a calm and stylish gentleman carrying an umbrella, wearing a bowler hat, and speaking with effortless confidence. He became one of the most recognizable figures in British television history. Yet, the John Steed who first appeared in The Avengers during 1961 was a very different man. The earliest version of Steed was mysterious, unpredictable, and often difficult to understand. Viewers were not given clear answers about who he worked for or how much authority he possessed. His connection to government agencies remained vague, adding an air of uncertainty around every move he made. This uncertainty became one of the character's most fascinating qualities. Unlike traditional detectives or police officers, Steed rarely followed normal procedures. He moved through investigations in his way, gathering information from unusual sources and appearing wherever trouble was brewing. He seemed to know far more than he revealed, making him both intriguing and slightly unsettling. In these early episodes, Steed often relied on manipulation, deception, and intimidation to achieve his goals. He was willing to mislead suspects, pressure criminals, and keep important information hidden when it suited his mission. This gave him a moral ambiguity that separated him from many television heroes of the period. Viewers could never be completely certain what Steed was thinking. Even when he appeared to be helping the heroes, there was always a sense that he was playing a larger game. This mysterious quality made him compelling, but it also made him feel far more dangerous than the version that would later become famous. His appearance reflected this darker identity. The original Steed dressed in a crumpled trench coat and a fedora hat. His clothing was practical rather than fashionable. Combined with his serious expression and cautious behavior, he looked more like a hard-boiled detective than a sophisticated secret agent. There was little sign of the polished icon who would later capture audiences around the world. The famous bowler hat was absent. The umbrella that became his trademark had not yet become part of his image. The tailored suits and gentlemanly charm that later defined him were still years away. Behind the scenes, this was partly because the producers themselves had not fully decided who John Steed was supposed to be. During the first season, the character continued to evolve from episode to episode. The creative team experimented with different ideas while searching for the version that worked best. Patrick Macnee played an important role in this development. As the series progressed, he gradually helped shape Steed's personality and style. Many of the qualities audiences now associate with the character did not exist from the beginning. They emerged slowly as the show found its identity. The world around Steed also contributed to his darker image. Early stories focused on sale of illegal substances, blackmail, criminal syndicates, death conspiracies, and corruption. These were serious subjects rooted in crime and social fears rather than fantasy or adventure. The atmosphere reflected concerns that were common in Britain after the Second World War. Then disaster struck when the show's leading star unexpectedly walked away. The exit that nearly ended the Avengers. By the end of the first series of The Avengers in 1961, the show faced a problem that could have ended its story almost as quickly as it had begun. What happened next would not only save the program, but completely change its future. When The Avengers first premiered, Ian Hendry was the star. He played Dr. David Keel, the central character whose search for justice drove the entire narrative. The series followed Keel after the death of his fiancée, Peggy, and much of the action revolved around his investigations into the criminal world responsible for her death. Viewers were introduced to events through his eyes, and he served as the emotional heart of the story. Alongside him was John Steed, played by Patrick Macnee. Although Steed was an important part of the show, he was not the main attraction. At that stage, few people would have predicted that he would one day become the defining face of the entire franchise. As the first series aired, Ian Hendry's popularity continued to grow. He quickly became one of Britain's fastest-rising television actors. His performances attracted attention, and new opportunities began to appear. As his career expanded, Hendry decided to leave The Avengers after the first series. For the producers, the news created an immediate crisis. The show had been built around Dr. David Keel. His personal tragedy had launched the story. His investigations connected the episodes. His character provided the emotional foundation for the series. Losing him meant losing the very person around whom the entire program had been constructed. Suddenly, the future of the Avengers became uncertain. Behind the scenes, difficult questions had to be answered. The production team had to decide whether the show could continue at all. Without its leading character, cancellation seemed like a real possibility. Some may have wondered if the series had already reached its natural end. Another option was to introduce a completely new lead character. This approach would allow the program to continue while replacing the role left behind by Hendry. However, doing so carried serious risks. Audiences had already become familiar with Dr. Keel, and a replacement might not be accepted. There was also a third possibility. The producers could shift their attention to John Steed and build the future of the show around him. This idea was far from guaranteed to succeed. At that point, Steed was still developing as a character. He was mysterious and intriguing, but he had not yet become the polished figure later associated with the series. Entrusting the entire future of the program to him was a major gamble. In the end, the producers made a bold decision. Rather than introducing another replacement for Keel, they elevated Steed to the leading role. That choice changed everything. By placing Steed at the center of the story, the creators opened the door to a completely new direction. The show no longer had to focus on a doctor seeking justice for a personal tragedy. Instead, it could explore a much wider range of stories involving investigations, intelligence work, and national security. The decision also allowed Patrick Macnee to shape the future identity of the character. As Steed became more prominent, his personality began to evolve. The mysterious operative, who had once worked alongside Keel, slowly became the driving force behind the entire series. But how did a struggling crime drama suddenly become one of television's most revolutionary shows? The arrival of Kathy Gale and the television scandal she created. In September 1962, the Avengers introduced a character who would completely change the direction of the series. Her name was Kathy Gale, and from the moment she appeared,
When Honor Blackman joined the cast of the Avengers in 1962, the episode Warlock was designed to introduce her character of Kathy Gale to the audience.
it became clear that she was unlike anyone television audiences were used to seeing. Played by Honor Blackman, Kathy Gale arrived during the second series of the show. At a time when most female television characters followed familiar patterns, Kathy stood out immediately. She was intelligent, confident, independent, and fully capable of handling herself in dangerous situations. Instead of fitting into traditional roles, she brought something entirely new to British television. Kathy was portrayed as a highly educated woman with expertise in anthropology. This alone made her different from many female characters of the early 1960s. Television often presented women as secretaries, romantic interests, or supportive wives whose main purpose was to assist male characters. Kathy Gale did not fit any of those expectations. She entered stories as an equal. Her intelligence was one of her greatest strengths. She approached problems carefully, analyzed situations, and often discovered important clues before anyone else. Rather than waiting for others to solve mysteries, she actively helped drive investigations forward. What truly surprised audiences, however, was the way she handled danger. Kathy practiced judo and was more than capable of defending herself. In many episodes, she fought opponents, escaped difficult situations, and took control when circumstances became dangerous. She did not stand on the sidelines while others took action. Even more unusual for the time, Kathy frequently rescued John Steed instead of waiting for him to rescue her. This reversed a pattern that audiences had seen for years. Television viewers were accustomed to seeing male heroes save women in distress. Kathy Gale challenged that idea. She often proved just as resourceful, determined, and capable as Steed himself. For many viewers, this was exciting and refreshing. For others, it was controversial. Her arrival quickly became one of the most talked-about developments in the series. Some audience members admired her confidence and welcomed a stronger female character. They appreciated seeing a woman who could think for herself, defend herself, and contribute as an equal partner. Not everyone felt the same way. Some critics argued that Kathy was too aggressive. Others believed she was too dominant. Certain viewers felt uncomfortable with a character who openly challenged traditional expectations about how women should behave on television. The debates surrounding Kathy Gale soon became part of the show's growing reputation. Another major source of discussion was her clothing. Kathy often appeared in leather outfits that became one of the most recognizable parts of her image. These costumes attracted enormous attention. For many fans, they reinforced her confidence, strength, and individuality. The look became closely associated with the character and helped make her memorable. At the same time, the leather clothing sparked controversy. Some viewers considered it too bold for television. Others felt it pushed against social expectations of the period. Whether audiences loved it or criticized it, people were talking about it. As discussions about Kathy Gale spread, so did interest in The Avengers. Yet while The Avengers was becoming more daring and successful, something else was happening behind the scenes that would erase much of its history forever. How The Avengers was erased. One of the most surprising chapters in the history of The Avengers has nothing to do with spies, villains, or dangerous missions. Instead, it involves something that happened behind the scenes. While the series was growing in popularity and moving toward greater success, a television practice of the 1960s quietly erased a large part of its history. Today, many fans would love to watch every episode from the earliest years of The Avengers. Unfortunately, that is impossible. A significant portion of the original series no longer exists. Episodes that once aired on television simply disappeared, leaving behind gaps that can never be completely filled. The reason was not a fire, a natural disaster, or an accident. The loss happened because of a common broadcasting practice during the period. In the 1960s, videotape technology was expensive. Television companies had to carefully manage their resources, and many broadcasters viewed videotapes as items that could be reused rather than preserved. Storing large collections of old programs was not considered a major priority. As a result, television companies regularly erased recordings after they had been broadcast. ABC Television, the company that produced The Avengers,
British sci-fi television series The Avengers, starring Ian Hendry, Patrick Macnee and Ingrid Hafner, and was broadcast by ABC Television on 5th of August 1961.
followed practices that were common throughout the industry. Broadcasters often wiped existing recordings so the tapes could be used again for new productions. At the time, few people imagined that future generations would want to revisit these programs decades later. Television was largely seen as something temporary. Once a program had aired, many believed its purpose had already been fulfilled. Because of this approach, a large portion of The Avengers disappeared. Today, most of the first series is missing. Major portions of the second series are also gone. Many episodes that once reached viewers across Britain can no longer be watched. For fans of the show, this loss is particularly frustrating because these missing episodes contain the earliest and most distinctive version of The Avengers. This was the period when the series was still finding its identity. It was darker, more realistic, and more focused on crime than the stylish version that later became famous around the world. These early stories explored death investigations, criminal organizations, corruption, and undercover operations. They offered a very different experience from the colorful adventures that would follow in later years. Yet much of this original material has vanished. Not every episode was completely lost. Some survive in unusual forms. A number of episodes exist only as audio recordings. While the pictures have disappeared, the soundtracks remain, allowing historians and dedicated fans to hear performances that can no longer be seen. Other episodes survive through written scripts. These documents provide detailed information about the stories, characters, and dialogue. Although they cannot replace the original footage, they help preserve important parts of the show's history. Still, photographs also play a valuable role. Production images taken during filming offer glimpses of scenes, costumes, and sets that no longer exist on video. Combined with production paperwork and surviving records, these photographs help researchers piece together what audiences originally watched. The work of reconstructing these lost years has become a fascinating challenge. Television historians rely on many different sources to understand the missing episodes. They study scripts, production documents, cast interviews, surviving soundtracks, newspaper listings, and television archives. Each piece of information contributes to a larger picture. Cast interviews often provide valuable memories about filming experiences. Production paperwork reveals how episodes were planned and created. Newspaper listings confirm broadcast schedules and episode details. Together, these sources help historians recover parts of a history that seemed lost forever. Even with these efforts, the experience remains incomplete. Reading documents and listening to audio recordings is not the same as watching a fully preserved episode. Many viewers are unable to compare the original version of The Avengers with the later versions because so much footage has disappeared. This creates one of the greatest ironies in the history of the series. Just as the Avengers was beginning its transformation into a major television success, much of its earliest history was being erased. The darker and most realistic version of the show became the least accessible version. The series would go on to achieve international fame, attract millions of viewers, and become one of Britain's most celebrated television productions. Yet, the foundation on which that success was built remains partly hidden from view. If much of the original show disappeared, how do historians know what those lost episodes contained? The dark side of the Avengers that vanished from television. The earliest years of the Avengers remain some of the most fascinating and mysterious in the history of the series. Between 1961 and 1963, the show presented stories that were far darker and more serious than many people expect today. While later seasons became known for style, charm, and imaginative adventures, the original years explored a world filled with crime, danger, and human weakness. What makes these years even more intriguing is that many of the episodes no longer survive. Because so much footage was erased, viewers can only piece together parts of these stories through surviving records. Yet the information that remains reveals a version of the Avengers that feels very different from the one most audiences remember. The early episodes were built around threats that felt real and immediate. Instead of bizarre villains or unusual inventions, the stories focused on criminal activities that could exist in everyday life. Death rings became a recurring source of danger. Investigations often centered on organized groups carrying out violent crimes while attempting to stay hidden from authorities. These plots created an atmosphere of constant tension. Characters were not simply facing eccentric opponents, they were confronting people capable of serious violence and deception. Smuggling networks also played an important role in many stories. Criminals operated in secret, moving illegal goods while avoiding detection. These cases allowed the series to explore hidden worlds operating beneath the surface of ordinary society. The investigations often led characters into dangerous situations where trust was difficult and betrayal was common. Political corruption formed another major theme. Some stories examined the misuse of power and the damage caused when individuals placed personal gain above public responsibility. These plots reflected concerns that audiences could easily understand, giving the series a sense of realism that distinguished it from many later spy adventures. Criminal conspiracies frequently drove the action. Rather than presenting isolated crimes, the series often portrayed larger networks of people working together behind the scenes. Uncovering these schemes required patience, intelligence, and careful investigation. The mysteries unfolded gradually, creating suspense and keeping viewers engaged from beginning to end. The show also explored illegal trade operations and blackmail schemes. These storylines dealt with manipulation, exploitation, and hidden threats. Characters often found themselves trapped in situations where appearances could not be trusted. Secrets became powerful weapons, and uncovering the truth was rarely simple. The tone of these early episodes reflected the seriousness of their subject matter. Rather than embracing fantasy or spectacle, the series leaned toward noir thrillers, police investigations, and psychological dramas. The atmosphere was often tense and uncertain. Danger could emerge unexpectedly, and victories were not always straightforward. This approach gave the original series a unique identity. The stories focused on investigation, observation, and careful reasoning. Emotional pressure and moral uncertainty frequently played important roles. Characters were often forced to navigate complicated situations where clear answers were difficult to find. For modern audiences, familiar with the colorful later years of the Avengers, these early stories can seem surprisingly different. The contrast is striking. What would eventually become a stylish international trend began as a much darker and more grounded drama. As the series gained attention beyond Britain, another challenge began to emerge. Producers became increasingly aware of broadcasting standards in other countries, particularly the United States. International success offered exciting opportunities, but it also created new considerations. Content that was acceptable in Britain was not always viewed the same way elsewhere. Concerns began to arise regarding violence within the stories. The serious criminal themes and dangerous situations attracted attention from those responsible for television standards. Discussions also emerged around adult undertones that occasionally appeared in certain situations and character interactions. Suggestive content received greater scrutiny as well. Even relatively subtle material could attract concern when programs were being considered for wider distribution. Costuming choices also became part of the conversation. Outfits that appeared bold or modern for the period sometimes generated debate among broadcasters evaluating content for different audiences. American television standards often differed from British standards, creating situations where producers had to think carefully about how the series might be received abroad. At the same time, the growing popularity of the show encouraged new creative directions. Audiences responded positively to stylish presentation and memorable characters. Producers recognized that visual appeal could become an important part of the series' identity. Gradually, glamour, fashion, and sophistication began playing larger roles. These elements did not replace the existing formula overnight. Instead, they emerged slowly as the show evolved and expanded its audience. This shift laid the foundation for the next major transformation in the history of the Avengers. The darker, crime-focused drama of the early years was beginning to give way to something new, something more stylish, more distinctive, and ultimately more famous around the world. So how did this grim crime series transform into the stylish trend that conquered the world? The reinvention that buried the original show. Between 1965 and 1969, the Avengers underwent the biggest transformation in its history. The dark crime drama that had begun with death investigations and personal revenge evolved into something entirely different. By the end of the decade, the series had become one of the most recognizable television programs in the world. But the journey was filled with dramatic changes, controversies, and challenges. A major turning point arrived in September 1965 with the introduction of Emma Peel, played by Diana Rigg. Her arrival marked the beginning of a new era that would define the series for generations of viewers. At the same time, important production changes were taking place behind the scenes. The series moved from videotaped production to filmed production, giving episodes a more polished appearance. Budgets increased, allowing for more ambitious stories and improved visual presentation. The show also expanded into international markets and reached larger audiences outside Britain. Distribution in the United States grew significantly, helping the series gain worldwide recognition. In 1967, color episodes were introduced, making the program even more visually striking. As these changes unfolded, the creative direction of the series shifted as well. The realistic crime stories of the early years gradually gave way to a more imaginative style. Fashion became a major part of the show's identity. Glamour played a larger role in both characters and storytelling. Surreal humor appeared more frequently, giving the series a distinctive personality. The villains also became more unusual. Instead of focusing mainly on organized crime and corruption, the show introduced eccentric opponents and increasingly imaginative plots. Science fiction concepts began appearing in stories, creating adventures that felt far removed from the darker atmosphere of the original series. Pop art influences shaped the visual style, helping the Avengers stand out from other television programs of the period. As the show expanded internationally, new challenges emerged. American broadcasters and sponsors closely examined the content before it reached viewers. Certain elements attracted particular attention. Costumes were reviewed carefully. Dialogue received greater scrutiny. Adult undertones became a topic of discussion, and scenes involving violence were examined more closely than before. These concerns reflected differences between British and American television standards. Material considered acceptable in Britain sometimes received additional attention when prepared for American audiences. As a result, producers had to remain aware of how the show might be viewed in different markets. Despite these challenges, the Emma Peel era became enormously successful. Diana Rigg quickly became one of the most recognizable faces on television. Her intelligence, confidence, and chemistry with Patrick Macnee helped create one of the most memorable partnerships in television history. Yet success did not eliminate controversy. One of the most famous disputes connected to the series involved Diana Rigg's salary. Reports emerged that she had learned some crew members were earning more money than she was. The issue became public and attracted widespread media attention. Discussions about pay created tension between Rigg, the producers, and studio management. Newspapers followed the story closely, turning it into one of the most talked about behind-the-scenes controversies associated with the series. At the same time, rumors circulated about disagreements between Diana Rigg and Patrick Macnee. Accounts of their relationship varied, and different stories emerged over the years. Regardless of the details, the reports became part of the show's growing legend and added another layer of fascination for fans. When Diana Rigg eventually left the series, the reaction was immediate. Fans expressed disappointment, and newspapers covered the departure extensively.
And I felt as if I was ditching him, and I can only tell you that he was wonderfully generous about my leaving.
Many viewers wondered whether the show could survive without the actress who had become such an important part of its success. The producers introduced Tara King, played by Linda Thorson, as Emma Peel's replacement. However, audiences quickly began comparing the two characters. Critics argued that the chemistry had changed, and many fans believed something important was missing. The comparisons followed Tara King throughout her time on the series. By the end of the 1960s, the Avengers looked almost nothing like the program that had premiered in 1961. The gritty story that began with the death of Peggy had evolved into a colorful international spy adventure filled with style, imagination, and spectacle. The original version of the Avengers was never banned or deliberately hidden. Instead, it gradually disappeared through a combination of tape wiping, changing audience expectations, international market demands, censorship concerns, production reinventions, cast departures, and creative transformations. Together, these forces reshaped the series and left behind a fascinating television legacy that few could have predicted when the journey first began. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe, and also click the next video shown on your screen.